Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about containment feeding. I'm Millie Shields from of Primary Industries, and today I'm joined by Brett Littler from New South Wales Local Land Services and Ben Gilmore from Biosecurity Queensland. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Making Maidens Weight producer demonstration site, which is funded by Meat Livestock Australia and is supported by Leading Sheep and GrazingFutures livestock business resilience projects. So you may have noticed that I've given you access to your microphones today. Please keep yourself on mute for the duration of the presentations. But if you do have questions, you can pop them in the chat box along the way, or the Q&A box should be open for you as well. When we get to question time, that's when you can unmute yourself and ask away. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Leading Sheep website, which is where you can find out more about the PDS as well. Once the recording is available, you will receive an email with the link to the web page as well as the slides from today's presentations. And at the end of the discussion today, I will pop up a link to a feedback form. We would really appreciate it if you could take 2 or 3 minutes of your time to answer these questions. And this helps us demonstrate the value and usefulness of activities we run, which might offer up additional opportunities and projects down the track. So thank you in advance for that. So thanks to everyone who has answered the free webinar questions. That's really given us a good idea of where everyone is at with regards to their interest in containment feeding. So most of you on here do currently containment feed or have done in the past, with 1 or 2 considering it as a future strategy for you. And the main purpose for containment feeding within this group was found to be looking after your weaners to set them up to be productive adults, with a second common purpose or reason for containment feeding being for drought management. And there are a couple of people who use these setups for feeding ewes prior to joining and feeding other classes of animals for a specific purpose. So now I would like to hand over to Brett Littler. Brett is a Senior Land Services Officer with New South Wales Local Land Services, with extensive experience in containment feeding setups in New South Wales. He comes recommended by Gordon Refshorgi, who is our subject matter expert for the PDS. And while his experience is based in a more southern region, the principles and design elements should be applicable up here. So I'll hand over to you, Brett.
Okay. Yes, so definitely I've got a New South Wales focus, and that's why I appreciate Ben being on to talk about some of the stuff later on. But you know, confinement feeding, the definition, and look, it's really defined as full hand feeding or management of stock in small paddocks at pens. I call confinement feeding, that's what we had in New South Wales, Victoria, containment. There's multiple different terms. We hear sacrifice paddocks, drought locks, stock management areas, stock containment areas, etc. So there's a huge myriad of different wording for it, but typically it occurs during periods of poor or low feed quality or quantity, and that's really the basics of it. Really, for me, the primary objective for confinement feeding is to maintain flock productivity. It's also to reduce grazing pressure, and also to maintain that pasture, perennial pastures, and protect that asset, if you like, on our farms. Now, we've got a publication that we put together in New South Wales. It's a guide to confinement feeding of sheep and cattle. It's been developed as part of the Saving Our Soils program. I've got to do the obligatory. That's where I'm currently working at the moment with this organisation at a state-based role in New South Wales. But this is one of the publications that we've put together. In putting this, and this publication really has all the nuts and bolts of a lot of the questions that people have put in there. You know, how many animals, etc., etc., etc. So we've broken this publication up into a number of different chapters. So there's specific things, you know, mob densities and all that. And we've got the best science that we've got around that in there. When I talk about this publication, I do so, and particularly looking at these slide sets. It was put together with the three principal authors was Jeff Duddy, who was the sheep feedlot specialist in New South Wales DPI. He's now a private consultant. Jeff House, who was the beef feedlot specialist in New South Wales, he's now a private consultant, and myself. So I'm now with Local Land Services. But really, whenever I'm doing these presentations, it's important that I acknowledge that we've forgotten whose slides who's done what, and it's a myriad of all our experiences. So be aware. Look, some of the real pros of confinement feeding, and look, it's been around for years and years and years. And I remember when I first joined the department, I was a trainee livestock officer almost 30 years ago, going around where people had drought lots in the hunter and everything, where I did the majority of my training to kick off in the early years. And yeah, they had different setups, but really preserve that topsoil, that ground cover and nutrients. Big one is livestock energy needs, and particularly in extensive systems, we drop their needs by 10 to 15% daily on the energy requirements. Really, the big thing too is we maintain or improve our core breeder base. We're looking after our pastures. One of the things that we do see is we get that pasture response rates after rain. And for me, one of the big things, particularly during 17, 18 and 19, was the fact that, we'd get these force breaks where we'd get a 25 mil or an inch rainfall event, we'd get short green pick, and all of a sudden sheep would go off chasing feed or cattle would go off chasing that green pick. Quality was there, quantity wasn't. Bites that they needed to get their nutrition just wasn't there, and all of a sudden we had sheep then coming back on, and we had issues. And I think that's one of the important things, particularly when we do get one of these breaks, or we're able to bring them in and let that pasture get away, let that quantity, and it stops some of those issues with those animals going out and chasing. Also, it enables to maintain that body weight and condition of the animals. The other one is we've got the weaner adult growth rates and feed conversion efficiency. We can also look at that dam lamb survival and calf survival. Wool quality side of things, we can look at the point of break and staple strength. You also need to be mindful of the dust mud soiling of that, and also the changing of staple strength when we're releasing them out. And that was one of the big learnings for me into 1920 when we had our break here, and sort of particularly looking at some of the people who managed it well with level of protein, levels of energy prior to putting them out, and how they manipulated that to minimise some of those issues. We can meet market specs with them. If you've got them locked up, you can have them assessed, work out where you can go, what you can do. Also, we can look at the cash flow value add, but also some pretty big animal welfare things, and I'll talk about some stuff down the track where, I'll talk about potential issues of confinement feeding. But, what we tend to find is by having these animals locked up, we're monitoring them more, we're getting more care on them, we're seeing things as they're starting to happen. Whereas in a paddock situation, we sometimes tend to miss that. Really, though, the big ones for me is time saving. And this is one of those ones throughout my career where I've seen people who have implemented this type of thing. All of a sudden they've got them in close, and all of a sudden the time from going and feeding and managing is tremendously reduced. I've got a personal example out the road out here with one farmer and his son. I've been out, they've now set up a full system where they've now got it for their merinos, and the son's comment, Hamish, was to me, he said, we're not doing this shit again where dad's feeding 7 days a week. And just we had a fairly dry pinch last year where these people are located. And I was talking to Hamish the other day, and he basically said, look, he said, we're feeding every second day. I was doing it in an hour. by having them there rather than going out to different paddocks and the like. So with that comes a reduced stress. You're not busting yourself, you're not going out and doing all that. So that's for me some of the big pros with it. Some of the cons, definitely you're in full production rations. There can be infrastructure costs, the potential health issues, acidosis, ammotoxicity, pulpy kidney, pink eye, salmonella, coccidiosis, Campylobacter, all these things. But in saying that, I've seen all those and more when fed out in the paddock. So it's all about management and how do we manage and how do we set it up to minimise some of these things. The big one is water quality and supply is absolutely critical. And invariably, in the last few months, I've got a couple of trainees here that have been a couple of graduates that have been going out looking at different bits and pieces in some of these places. And the one thing they've learnt from me, one of the first questions I ask where I go onto a place is, where's your water? How far? And what's the quality like? Because those things are really critical. Because if you set them up, you've got these areas working, it's important that you've got that water set up and you've got good quality. Invariably, if we don't have good quality water, then that leads to a whole heap of potential health issues and does. And I've seen issues with merino lambs with water quality that has taught me this over and over again. I've gone out, trying to look for this, that, and everything else like that, and invariably comes back to a water issue that's then led to multiple other issues popping up. So really important one. Big thing, I'm not that bright a fella, so I work on the KISS principle. Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be flash. It's just got to be functional. I know we see lots of things, people setting up these U-Butte systems, look at this, look at that, and everything else like that, but it just has to be functional. This example is a photo of a producer out to the west of my location here at Mudgee, and he had a feed mixer and just had two hot wires. It worked. Didn't look great. Yep, there were some other bits and pieces, but this worked for him, particularly with the numbers. So, if possible, use what you've got and use that on your farm. What I would say, considerations for your site selections, and men will probably cover this, but big ones for me are buffer and separation distances. What I would say, if and I've got the prime example, my best spot for feeding on my place and where I've fed my sheep in the past is up at my yards and my facilities. Unfortunately, that's on our road. It's a dirt road, which was all well and good up until about 5 years ago when up the road from me, we had a person decide to put up a glamping setup. And I've had the questions from some of the people that have moved into the area, but also with some of the people that are travelling going up there, Maserati going on a dirt road, their level of understanding of what's actually going on is a bit one of those things. So out of sight is actually a good thing, particularly where we get different people moving through the landscape that may not have that understanding of what's actually happening. Topography is a huge one. Where we're going to set it up, soil type, access. Real big one is also proximity to facilities, water again, shelter, and thinking about where we're going to get rid of things if we get things happening. If possible, it should be well drained. It should be close to feed storage, water supply, stock in, as I've said. But also, we want to try and minimise stress and any environmental issues that we may have. So confinement needs to be accessible in all weather. Really important. If it can take a couple of things away, this is one of them as well. We do, and we had an incident where we've had 4 inches of rain here in a storm event in some areas around me just over the weekend. If you've got them set up feeding in those areas, you need to be able to get in and get that feed to them, particularly during these periods where we get that. One of the worst disasters, and this is a cattle example, was set up on black soils. The bloke had a brilliant setup. He couldn't get to it. Near his facilities, everything else like that, wasn't able to drive there, and it was after a 4-inch rainfall event. Yeah, all of a sudden, so need to be accessible. Um, the big thing to be aware of is that there's never going to be the perfect site. I've yet to find one that I go, this ticks all the boxes. I went to one probably about 4 months ago that's in the process of setting up and everything else like that. Near the yards, near the facility, great soil, great setup, the whole lot, but the aspect isn't quite perfect on it. But it still ticks all the other boxes and we can make it work. So be aware of some of those things and see how it works. With topography, the ideal slope we talk about is 2 to 4% is ideal. Steep slopes over 4% are prone to erosion and increase your need to feed, the feed needs of those animals. You've also got to be aware of where your runoff is. Okay. So what I would say to people is think about where the water's going to run. And this little photo here is a classic example. Ideally, you want the water draining from the front to the back of the pen. In this scenario here with these sheep, it's draining down the hill. So all of a sudden, you're getting the manure, the mud, the muck builds up each pen to each pen to each pen. And all of a sudden, bad luck if you're the bottom pen. So just one of those things to be aware of, where we're going to get some of this runoff, where's it going to go. Also, have a good look at your soil type. Obviously, we prefer a medium clay loam. Sandy soils, not a huge fan, and really heavy clay soils, they pug up, etc. So, be a bit aware of some of that soil type, where it is and the like. Because they will get wet at some stage. Invariably, we will get some rain. And it's one of those ones to just be a little bit aware of, that you've got the right type of soil. Access to facilities and the like. Ideally, you want somewhere where you're going to have that storage and feed preparation. And this is particularly, may not be relevant for some people, but particularly in some areas where they've got silage and the like. Last thing you want to be doing is carting it from A to B and all of a sudden spending an hour getting it there, hour getting it back. All of a sudden you're defeating the purpose. So you're much better setting these areas up where you've got those feeding areas already. Once again, make sure you've got that all-weather access, that you can get in and out. You've got that minimise that distance between everything, as we talked about, but also your stockyards. So I've made the decision at my place, I'm now going to move my feeding area because where it is up and away from our road. Yes, I've had to go out and purchase a bit more gear. I've got a bit of other yard stuff. I've moved my feeding stuff back up there, where I've got silos and the like. But I've got a little bit of a yard handling set up, bit of a portable system for my sheep, for my cattle. I've just looked at a few pens and a little cheap crush and the like. So wasn't perfect site, got a better one now. It's away from the road. It's one of those ones. So really having those yards close, particularly if things you do start to have an issue, can really help the situation. You're able to draft, sort out, monitor animals, look at how they're performing and the like. So that's important. As I said, water, need it. It's got to be good quality. You really don't use dams or creek lines or soaks, etc., etc. Not great. That water quality, and we particularly one to be aware of, if you're not cleaning your troughs regularly, what we've seen in the past, where all of a sudden you come in, clean it, and it hasn't been cleaned for a fair old period, all of a sudden the animals will start drinking. They start drinking, they start eating. All of a sudden, we end up with acidosis and everything. So it's one of these ones that, if you do have a water issue, I tell people to be aware of getting them back on feed, because we know that water intake will have an effect on those animals. Um, but also, we talk about flow rate, at least 10 to 15 litres per head per hour. That's a cattle one, but still an ideal type of thing that you need good flow. And if you can get that pipe in under, because we do know water temperature does have an effect on how much they do and don't drink. Also, at least a couple of days, 2, 3, 4 days, water supply up your sleeve. So if you do get something broken, it gives you that chance to get it fixed. And we all know that it'll tend to happen on a Friday afternoon as everyone's bolting to go somewhere. Some of the things that we do talk about for sheep, we talk about 30 centimetres plus 1.5 centimetres per sheep. So if we're dealing with 300 sheep as an example, that's 2.8 metre total linear access. So that's the distance all the way around. It is important that you've got that. The last thing that I like seeing when I'm driving and going and having a look at this is sheep queuing up trying to get a drink, because that's telling me there could be a few things going on. It's something I do rely on quite heavily when I'm out investigating these and having a look at them. Is that behaviour at a trough, and that's a first indicator of water quality issues. It can be also an indicator of some other things that are going on. So being aware of that, and that information's in our guide. But the big one with this is troughs should be really drained and cleaned regularly. I talked about merino weaners there before. We know they're particularly susceptible to water quality issues, and cleaning of that water is vitally important. One of the first indicators that I know that I've got a water issue is when I start to see sheep queuing at the flow end. I had an example. This is probably about 10 or 15 years ago, where we were investigating some weaner lamb deaths, out looking at them, trying to work it out. I had a trainee livestock officer with us. I was looking. I'm going, oh, you check this, you check that, you check this, and we went up, and I was watching some sheep come in and drink, and literally there was only one lamb at a time in 1,000 odd lambs that was drinking. And I sort of went, oh, we've got a problem here. We cleaned the trough. The lambs rushed in. They started drinking. All of a sudden, they stopped drinking from the far end and kept drinking to the flow end and not stopped. When we came up and actually had a look, there was a fine film of dust that formed over the top of that, because the sheep had come in, the dust had come in on top. The way the trough was set up, it came up and over and dumped. And that was the main cause of the problem. And it really was one of those things that was a bit of a bingo moment earlier on in my career. So really important that you do look at that type of stuff. I'm not going to go into that water quality, but rule of thumb, 10% of live weight will give you an indicator of how much they'll drink. So, that information's in the guide, so you can have a look at that. What I would say from a practical standpoint is you want the water to run out of that trough, out of that area. I've seen a lot of issues, and sheep in particular, we see issues where in underneath that trough, if there's a bit of water sitting, they won't drink from that area. They'll come around. We'll see it with feeders as well. If you're using feeders, that they'll move around. So one of those ones that I tend to say to people, be aware, move this to a certain spot, get the water draining out and away. I really don't like water dumping back into pens. You end up eating in, out, and underneath these troughs and the like. Also, this is one of those Western fence systems. It's not hot wired. It doesn't have the heat in it, but it works extremely well. Just a simple little plain wire setup. Once again, that water trough comes out. Um, that netting side of things, but still runs it out. We've still ended up with some of it coming in. That's going to restrict the bottom part of that trough for those animals getting in there. You could go whole hog and set it up like this one here, where it's got a dump straight out down the bottom. What I would say while I'm looking at this photo, I'm seeing more and more sheep people now just going with straight netting. I'm not a huge fan of the smaller netting. One of the big issues that we tend to run into, and some of the feedback I'm getting from a lot of producers, is heads getting stuck. People tend to go with that pig mesh. I don't know the correct terminology. That's what I know it as, pig mesh, the little stuff. Um, and it can be a real issue with heads getting stuck and things like that, because invariably that at some stage you'll get a little bit of green shoot outside. This case, it's not an issue, but I know some people where they've used some of that small mesh have taken to spraying a good half a metre to a metre off that, just to make sure there's no green pick so the sheep aren't putting their heads through to try to eat. So just one to be a little bit aware of. But this setup here, the other thing I like about just having the netting, the ring lock in between the pens, particularly if you're in the stage of cleaning that water, it makes it very easy just to jump from pen to pen to pen to pen. So it's one of those things that helps you to clean up. Whereas if you've got ring lock and then barb on top, I'll go to a go. I'm not as fit as I used to be, but definitely one of those ones that I don't like barb either. So, but just something to be a bit aware of that we're starting to see more of. The other thing too about shelter, um, ideally, yes, we like shelter. If you are going to put up shelter, in the cattle example here on the right-hand side, we like them north-south, so the sun can rise up and comes through, and that dries out underneath that area. What we tend to find with shelter is that if you've got that and it's limited, you can, and it doesn't dry, it can become a bit of an issue. What we do know from an animal production point of view is that sheep, and particularly merino sheep, tend to do what we're seeing in the middle photo. I could think of nothing worse than someone coming and sticking their head next to me, but they thermoregulate through the nose, breathing there. And you can see that they're quite, with those sheep there in the middle, got their head in underneath each other. Also, they do what we can see in that lamb in the background there, where it's lying flat, getting rid of that reflective heat, lying flat like that. And that's the way they minimise some of that heat side of things. So what I would say though, if you are going to put some of these structures up, and I've seen some people go to quite elaborate lengths, you've still got to get some airflow. So if you're blocking off down sides, that's going to stop some of that airflow. So just be a bit aware of that when you're doing it. But ideally, shade is recommended. Unfortunately, our native trees do not handle nutrient overly well. So if we're seeing trees around, it's particularly on the down slope, it can be a bit of an issue. Also, sheep tend to ring bark, cattle tend to ring bark trees, and this is the photo on the right is a place up our Canamble there, and you can actually see where those sheep, even though it's got a protector around it, they've got in and ring bark some of those trees. So be aware, if you've got some native trees in there, ideally you want a fence around them, otherwise they will ring bark and you won't have shade, and you'll just have something that drops a lot of branches, and can be a bit of an issue. Now, the stocking densities and mob sizes, be aware. I get phone calls from farmers all the time. I hear some people saying different bits and pieces. They're talking about, I had one bloke going, I run 1,200 sheep in a mob and it's never a problem, da 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 da. I'll put some stuff up here. There's some fundamental rules that we know if you break, you will run into some sort of problems. So stocking density, we're generally referring to the area and in metres squared for a number of livestock. So recommended for sheep, we talk 2 to 5. Ideally, I think 4 to 5 and 5 per metre square is good for sheep. You don't really, The more you go below that 5 metres, personal, anecdotally, what I tend to see is the more issues we get if you've got bigger stock numbers. The more space you go over that 5 metre squares for sheep, the less issues you have with bigger mobs, but we're not getting the effect of that dampening and dust suppression that we tend to see by that 5 metres square that we talk about. So these are suggested. Sheep and lambs, we talk about 5 metres square. For ewes and lambs, we talk about 100 metres square. So most setups that I'm dealing with are set up for around about that 4 to about 6 metres square for mob sizes is what we tend to look at. High stocking densities will reduce your infrastructure cost, obviously. We've got with less pens, space, surface fencing required per animal. So that's one of those ones. It helps reduce dust, but we know the problem is we don't have some hard science. So I'm telling you anecdotally, if we can get increased health and stress, environmental issues, if you end up with too many animals, and we're taking some stuff out of beef feedlots now. We're starting to see, it used to be the norm that a lot of beef feedlots used to be up to 300-400 head. We now know that's really down under about 150, 160. We know there's a difference between cattle and sheep with stress and the relationship of stress and how the difference associated there. But definitely we know bigger mobs, smaller area, more problems anecdotally. Smaller mobs, small areas, they tend to handle. They know who's who in the zoo. There was an example of a producer out in the Central West, rather vocal. And he talks about, I don't worry about this, I don't worry about that. And I went out to his place and I'm going, geez, like big mobs, there should be a few things there. He had big mob, big area. More importantly, his trough space that he had was huge. Our recommendation, we talk about 30 centimetres per ewe. I worked out that he had 68 centimetres, so over double the requirements. And you could see when those animals were let in, they went in with their social cohort and they stuck in different areas. Big gates, so allowed them to come in and through. So as I said, limited research, but we definitely know there's something that happens there. But what we do know is the older the animals, the less issues that we tend to find. So that's one of those ones. So smaller mob sizes will help with management, feeding and monitoring the animals. And what it can also do is help you find those shy feeders, but you can do that with weight. But definitely with younger, earlier wean lambs, you'll hear me say very small numbers so that we can pick those animals out if we're doing very early weaning. As I said, older mature stock, you've got more leniency, more give, and they handle things a bit better. Do not use confinement, containment areas for lambing or calving. It's just a recipe for disaster. The mismothering that happens, ewes coming in, pinching other lambs and the like. I know there was a recommendation running around. I have been involved where people have been in the situation where they have done it. It's huge amount of work going through, checking udders, seeing what's coming up, trying to drift a ewe and a lamb off, ewes and lambs off, trying to put in smaller mobs. I would really recommend that you look at lambing out in the paddock and try to set that up. Don't try to, a week, 2 weeks before. Try to get that set up a month before and start to get them out so you can control that introduction. Where I've seen a couple of issues where they've been let out is where people haven't controlled when they've let them out with ewes. They've just stopped feeding them and everything. You still need to manage them, but yeah, just be aware of that one. Suggested mob sizes, we talk lambs up to 350, ewes wethers 500. Obviously you can go over that. And I've got plenty of examples. Place I work with quite regularly, he's got 1200 plus. He's got trough space galore, how he sets it up, etc. All his lambs are educated. when he weans them, he brings them all in. They're locked up for 4 to 5 weeks to get them used to being locked up. He does small mobs then. Once he's got them set up for life. What I would say, that trough space, this is an example I've pinched off Jeff Duddy, and this is one that's a 35 metres of trough. There's 1,000 sheep, and that's 3.5 centimetres per head. You can see the extreme competition there. Another example that we have, this is a conveyor belt, put it up, but you'll see here with this one here, big mob, small trough space under what we usually recommend for trough space, and they had to go and retrofit all these PVC onto the steel posts because they had extreme competition. Those sheep were going up, pushing in hard, and all of a sudden they were going down. So one of those things I'd really look at your trough, look at your setup, so how you're going to sort that. Confinement feeding, pens, really, sheep and lambs, if it's 50 by 30, it's 1,500 metres, so you've got 300 per pen. I'm not going to dwell on that. Got a bit to get through, just a little bit. Pen design really comes down to the capital area available, stock numbers per pen, stock density, trough feeder space, pen slope, location, labour, equipment, etc. And also personal preference. General recommendations: feed troughs and bins at the front top section of the pen. Water troughs at the rear lower section, so you're getting that water out. Maximise, and also we're maximising that distance from the feed trough to the bin, so you're stopping a bit of that water contamination. Okay. Really, laneways to and from confinement areas are great. Allow for easier stock movements to and from pens. Can be used as a central feeding area, reducing that need for troughing within pens. And the need for adequate width to allow for the movement and equipment and vehicles in and out. Make sure you've got that space to turn around, particularly once it gets wet. One of those ones that goes, oh yeah, I can turn around, you're fine, but all of a sudden we start getting a bit wet, bit of slope, bit of move. Bigger gates are better gates. It's always one of those fun ones, they've got 1,000 odd sheep and got a 12-foot gate, and all of a sudden you're seeing issues with trying to move the sheep through, but more importantly, you're trying to bring gear and machinery through. So be a bit aware of that. Many confinement systems will feed bunks or troughing. Troughs can be made by using a huge amount of materials. Trail feeding on the ground is not my preferred method. There's a whole heap of things that happen, and enough experience has been gained. This is a little example of one down south. This is set up with hay, and as you can see with those animals in this, in the circular snail motion there, they've had a trail. They were being fed lentils. Sounds great, pretty nice, easy to pick up, etc. Have a look at the amount in that dust, the amount of waste that you go through, etc., etc. So when you're doing those calculations for how much you feed, we've got all the calculators. You need to make an allowance for how much waste you're going to get. If you're going to feed on the ground, it is one of those ones to be really aware of. Here's two examples here. The example on the right is a property in the central west zone. And we were there because all of a sudden we've had a camp to black the issue, and it was a real problem. So feeding on the ground, particularly where we're getting that waste and that contamination, can be a real issue. Thought he had a great idea, just digging a little trench, whacking that conveyor belting down, but it really did cause some problems. Some of the different ideas that we've got with some of the feeding systems: feeding trough out the front, holding yard, you can let them out each one at a time and in and feed each time. This is a setup that we visited. Yep, bust the slope rule every day of the week, this place, but it worked on the soil type. So that rule about slope, you need to have a look at that location and what it is. Highly technical area. He's got a bit of steel posts holding up a bit of tin, and I really do love the pull fencing that he's got, splitting it up in between. What he had, what it worked, and they fed a huge amount of sheep in that area. But notice the fence that he did have put around his trees, all nice and pushed in through his sheep. So, but it was still a feeding system that did work, and worked really well for these people over the years. One that I'm a bit of a fan of is this rotational pen system, where you put feed in one pen, you then let the animals in. Feed in the next pen, let the animals in. It stops some of those hardware issues where animals come in and around while you're trying to feed, which is always a problem. So that extra pen allows you to move those through. Big wide gates allows you to do that when you're putting troughs in the middle. Internal troughs, external troughs. I'm seeing more and more external troughs, but people have turned them into a rectangle. So they've got a long face, so it's got a huge length footprint over a narrow footprint. So it is one that we're seeing around. But if you are doing internal, just be aware trying to get in and feed in those systems can be quite difficult. Central versus fence line trough location. What we know is 80% of the sheep began, in a trial that's been done, began eating by day 2 when a central trough, versus day 7 for a fence line trough. We think that's to do with the predator prey type thing, what's out on the other side of me, etc. Whereas when they're eating in, head in, it's got my mates over here, someone else there, they feel a bit more protected. We believe that's what it is. There's a bit of conjecture about a couple of bits and pieces, but that's our thoughts. What we do also know is 78% of sheep eat daily, compared to 67% for fence line troughing. So that then ties into the health and the performance side of things. So just being a bit aware. If you are going to use troughing, it's important to consider cost per linear metre, durability, longevity of the troughing and material, clean ease, open ends, facilitate better cleaning, better drainage, and some drainage holes. I've just got a few photos here I'll put up. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. What I would just mention here, and there's a property not far away from where we took this photo with a producer that I'm good mates with, and during the middle of 18, he said, "You got to come for a look, Brett." I said, "Oh, what's going on?" He said, "I'm weaning limbs. You need to come and have a look." Went out to this bloke's place. He was using C-section for merino weaners. And what he'd done, he'd had trouble in 17 with getting his lambs onto the feed. He found that they were just walking straight over the C-section, walking around, and he was having a few issues. We talked about a few things. Oliver, in his wisdom, had actually gone and got C-section and put C-section under C-section. So he'd raised it up a little bit. And what he'd already weaned one mob, he had another mob to go. He said, "Need to come and have a look." Went out and had a look, and it was quite interesting. Those merino weaners walked in, and they were obviously looking for their mum and the like, walked in and then kicked the troughs, put their head down, and all of a sudden they'd been educated before he'd weaned them, and all of a sudden they put their head down and started eating. And that was sort of a little bit of a learning that I got there. It doesn't have to be U-Butte. This is a bit of trim deck that's been used on a place down south. Still got a bit of waste there, but they will come and pick that up. Relatively easy to clean and the like. Lots of different options. I'm not going to go through that, but what I thought, I'd just put up some different feeding systems here, just mindful of time. Conveyor belt, obviously, we see a lot of that, particularly if you're anywhere near mines, and I know all my conveyor belting cost me a few cartons of beer. All seconds, of course. I've seen this set up and where someone's used ring locks and they've cut the center out of that, getting the heads in. That tends to work okay. This is a bit more elaborate, where they've got it above and below. Also, the other day I was out at a place that just had box section running down. and just welded it onto steel posts and sat it down between it, and it worked quite well as well. Conveyor belting again, yeah, cleaning that, how you do it. I've seen a lot of people now set up blowers on the front of their ute. They'll run it down the middle, clean it out, and then run the animals back in behind. So yeah, got lots of different options. So polybelt, tarpaulins, obviously you got to be able to get in there and clean it. This was an old one of Duddy's that he had down south, where the bloke used to use that and used to get really dusty and messy. Hardware disease issues would come in, the mob running through, driving it, trying to get it clean, running in and under where they shouldn't be. So he eventually went to this system. Work, but you're still going to get the odd one get in where it shouldn't, as you can see there. That's got a couple of lambs in there. We've got shade cloth. We're seeing more and more of this. This is a producer group down our Goulburn, or actually Gunning, down south where the bloke had set it up, a bit of wire, clipped it on, etc. Made a reasonable trough, but it's got some other issues. You've got steel, gets hot, be aware of that. Doesn't have to be flashed. Lots of different options how to set it up. All right, if you're only feeding a few, that set up, but and if the wind gets hold of it, it'd end up down the peg pretty quick somewhere, I'd reckon. But how you're going to set it up really comes down to the individual, what you've got on the setup and the like. Tires, I've used tires at home for my sheep. Look, it works when I'm using different products, limited number that you can get around. I was using cottonseed and I'd see the sheep jump up and over and into it and end up with a bit of mess, etc. Obviously, PVC moulding, that's a bit more expensive and the like. But there's lots of options out there. I won't go through it all today, but probably what I would say is there's lots of options, lots of information out there. If you're interested, have a look at the guide. There's also a few online tutorials done by myself, Jeff Duddy, Jeff House, that's got more information on it, and hopefully that's answered a few questions, and I can talk a little bit more about it. But what I would also say is that these confinement feeding areas set up are for more than drought, for weaning your lambs, looking after them. I've used them for emergency management, used them for quarantine purposes, after big fire events, etc., etc. So, there's something that can be incorporated into your standard operating procedures on your place, and really are a benefit to the property. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Rightio. So now over to Ben Gilmore, who works in the intensive livestock unit with Biosecurity Queensland. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Millie. I will just make a quick correction. I'm not with Biosecurity Queensland, but just in the Department of Primary Industries, generally in the intensive livestock unit. But we do work closely with Biosecurity Queensland. Thanks everybody for having me along, and Millie for inviting me along to share with you guys. Thank you. Just by way of introduction, the intensive livestock unit in Queensland, we cover all of Queensland from a little group in Toowoomba, 6 of us, and we cover beef cattle feedlots, sheep feedlots, pig farming and poultry farming. So a lot of what I speak about today, it's all really geared more for the sheep, but you could pretty much say the same for the feedlots as well, for cattle feedlots, I should say. So, and Millie just asked me to speak from the point of view of the legal side of things around feed lotting in Queensland, and so that's what the main part of my time today is about. So under the Environmental Protection Regulation in Queensland, more than 150 standard cattle units and more than 1,000 standard sheep units being kept in a feedlot situation is what we call an environmentally relevant activity. And so you can see there, this is all straight out of the environmental protection regulation there. A feedlot means a confined yard or enclosure that contains watering and feeding facilities where cattle or sheep are fed entirely by hand or mechanically, and designed, constructed or used in a way that doesn't allow the animals to graze, essentially. When we're talking about sheep, it includes sheep of all ages. I believe there might be some goat producers out here in listening today. Goats aren't currently regulated under this legislation. However, I think it's just good environmental management to follow the same sort of management practices as you would for sheep. And a lot of the design and management practices that Brett's talked about in his talk were very much the same sort of principles as what we would talk to. So next slide, thanks, Millie. So just to give you a rough idea about what we do, so this one will be all about compliance, but we also do development assessment as well. And then the compliance side comes post-approval. So very much working on a risk-based model, which means that we're not out there trying to, use a big stick for everybody, regardless of whether they're actually causing a environmental harm. What we're looking for is there any risk to the environment as we do site inspections. So, apparently the slides aren't visible at the moment.
Let me try again.
I can see them.
I can too. Could someone let me know if that's still not showing? Cool.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks, Millie.
Thanks.
So like I said, our team is a small team, but we cover all of Queensland, and we've got 700 and depends on the at different stages, but roughly 720 sites that we look after and regulate. We do inspections on site, and we deal with community complaints, and generally those complaints are going to be closer to the coast. Generally, they're odour, noise, or effluent related complaints. So for piggeries and feedlots particularly, there's usually an effluent pond associated. So and if we get lots of rain, well, they can spill over. And then our process is, once we've done an inspection, we'll try and give you the feedback that we've identified there and then, but we'll also then send a letter out with that feedback as well. And we try and keep it fairly, practical as best as we can, and give reasonable timelines for addressing any of those matters. And that's really our preferred approach, is to work with the farmer, with the producer, to improve their environmental outcomes. We do have compliance tools or enforcement tools. However, we see the best value in terms of how we operate and regulate in providing that practical feedback to you as the producer, how we can see that you can improve, and then letting you make those improvements. So next slide there. Thanks, Millie. So as I said before, for sheep feedlotting, it's fairly clear in the legislation about what a sheep feedlot is. And so you can see the table there in terms of determining what a standard sheep unit is based on live weight. And that just helps you work out, you know, how many you've got in your feedlot. So if you're operating up to 100 or feeding up to 1,000 standard sheep units, you know, from our point of view, there's no need for a license. It's only once you go over that 1,000 standard sheep units that the licensing side of things comes in. And this is assuming that you're meeting that definition that we showed you there before. So a little bit of information there, as you can see, in terms of the cost of getting a license through us, what we call an environmental authority. And then there's an annual fee each year that's paid for whether you're, so in this case, we're talking about 1,000 to 10,000 standard sheep units. There's a couple of different ways you can go about getting a license. Everybody that needs a license must be a registered suitable operator, and that's through the permit and license management side of the Department of Environment. So standard application is quite a simple process. If you meet the eligibility criteria and you can operate in accord with the standard conditions, then it's pretty straightforward process. There's not a lot of information you need to provide to us as part of your application. It's basically paying the fee, submitting a form. We might ask a few questions, and then essentially you already know the eligibility criteria and standard conditions are the conditions of the environmental authority. So you already know what you're going to get back from us, essentially. So, however, if you don't meet the eligibility criteria or the standard conditions, then there's a different application process, which is a site-specific application. Now, one of the key things that I need to point out right up front is before you start this process of getting an environmental authority with us, we'll always tell you to go back to your local government, and that's something to be aware of, particularly if you're going to be putting in infrastructure that is more permanent. Before you go and spend a heap of money doing this, I do recommend that you go and talk to council and find out whether they have any requirements under their planning scheme for the type of activity that you're going to be building. So some councils are going to be tighter with their planning scheme than others. So I can't give you a definite, this is the rules for everywhere. It's a conversation that you need to have with the council. And I would also recommend that you have a chat with us and just put forward your plans. What we can do is give you some pre-lodgement advice about, you know, is it a good site? Are there any things that might be make that process more difficult for you? We can tell you before you actually start the application process, which hopefully sets you in good stead for once you get into the process and you've paid your fee, it's a bit more smooth sailing, hopefully. So if you can go to the next slide, thanks, Millie. So this is a little bit more just in terms of more than 10,000 standard sheep units. Once you get into that bigger threshold, you don't get that option of the standard application. You've got to do the standard application process. Sorry, the site-specific application process. All that means is there is an additional cost in terms of the application fee, and there is more information that's required to be given with your application, which is supporting information. We ask about a whole range of different things from management as well as design and location. And I'll go into a bit more of that later. There's, again, you got to go to talk to council first. Your development approval process starts with council, and then they refer it on to the state through the State Assessment and Referral Agency, or SARA as we call them. And they basically then refer it on to the DPI, but also any other state agency that may be triggered by this type of application. And that could be if there's mapped vegetation on your property, a waterway nearby, state roads and things like that. So what SARA does is basically pool all of our responses back into one response to you. And the idea is to try and make it a bit simpler and quicker process, and have an overarching body that's looking over all of the responses, and then that response goes back to you and the council for final approval. Once you get into a site-specific application process, or a more than 10,000 standard sheep unit proposal, the Environmental Authority application process happens at the same time as the development approval process. Yeah, thanks, Millie. Next slide. So I guess a lot of what Brett was talking about before was more about drought feeding, or a lot of it was about drought feeding, and not every one of the situations was necessarily a permanent setup. And under the Environmental Protection Regulation, there are some exemptions from being classified as a feedlot. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight those ones. Remiss of me not to. And so in terms of the legislative exemptions, if you're in a drought declared area, and the animals are fed no more than their nutritional requirements, or if they're in a feed pad in a paddock, or for your general sort of husbandry type scenarios, your sale, slaughter or transport, weaning, animal husbandry, milking or shearing. So those sorts of situations, if that's all you're doing, then you don't meet the criteria as a feedlot under the Act. And so a lot of this licensing stuff wouldn't apply to you. And so the intent of this, I think, really was to cut out, all your husbandry yards and the shearing yards, milking yards, things like that, and all your sale type yards. So, and then it goes through then into what animal husbandry is, and I guess the drought declared area is exactly that. It's considered and mapped as a current drought declared area. In that case, then you're exempt from needing to get a license. Go to the next slide. Thanks, Millie. With those exemptions, I guess the reason why we want to make it very clear to anybody looking at confinement feeding is often what we find, particularly in the cattle industry, but it could equally happen with the sheep industry, is there's always that creep. Not with everybody, but there's invariably a few producers where they see this as something that really works well for them in the drought time, and they think, well, look, this is working really well for our business. Let's just keep doing this as part of our business, and it builds into something more permanent. Not by intent from the beginning, but it just works for them, and they've made a decision that it's a good business decision. So I guess that's why we always will suggest to people, look, have a think about it, and all of the things that Brett said in terms of design and management are equally as important from our perspective as well. So I can't express it enough. Go and talk to council before you really start doing anything serious. Start planning now before the drought, so that you've got everything set up and you're doing things the correct way. The other thing to be aware of is, let's say you do meet the criteria to be a feedlot, a sheep feedlot. Don't let that be a constraint for you. There is the option, you can go and get your license, get your environmental authority, but then there is the option where if you're not going to be using it, you can actually suspend the authority, suspend that license for between 1 and 3 years at a time. We've got a lot of feedlots, cattle feedlots in particular, where they really are just opportunity lots. And so it's just not worth, feeding 500 or 1,000 head for some people when they've got a paddock full of buffel grass that does almost just as good a job of fattening their cattle. So they just suspend their licenses, and we've got some guys that they're perpetually sort of suspended. Every 3 years they come back to us, they fill in the form, and we suspend their license. And it means then they're not paying the annual fee every year, which, as you saw before, it's between, just under $2,000 and just under $4,000, $3,500 per year. So that's a significant cost to a business. The other thing is to remember, you can still run up to 1,000 standard sheep units in a feedlot, even while you're suspended. So it doesn't completely stop you from using that infrastructure that you've set up. And that may well be useful for some of the smaller producers where, that's how you do your yard weaning. And if you decide you do want to start operating at a higher level, well, then you can always call us on the day you're putting sheep back into the feedlot, and we terminate the suspension, and you just pay the fee from that date to the next anniversary date. So just wanted to highlight that just because you get a license doesn't mean you're stuck with paying for this license forever. There's a few ways you can sort of work around that and still save some money if that applies. So next slide. Thanks, Millie. So why are we even talking about this, and why are sheep feedlots and cattle feedlots so important and regulated? And I guess the story, the reasoning is, when you start locking up livestock in a more confined area, as you've seen in some of the photos that Brett shared, you obviously lose that grass cover, the vegetative cover in the pens, and that brings on a whole bunch of other environmental issues, as you can appreciate. You get some rain, the obvious one with your slope on the pens is you're going to have some erosion. And with that erosion, you're getting the water runoff that's also collecting all your manure from the sheep. You've got to think about, well, where is that going? It might only just run out into a paddock and you get a really nice green grassy paddock, and that's not a bad scenario. But if you're in quite a undulating area and you've got a creek nearby, well, then that can become an issue for water quality for those downstream from the feedlots. So it's probably one of the bigger issues for feedlots generally. The groundwater is another thing, and that's probably the only thing that that Brett didn't touch on in his presentation was really for feedlots in Queensland. One of the things that we expect, one of the industry standards, I guess, for cattle feedlotting in particular, is to have a compacted pad underneath the feedlot. And this will obviously be in the case where you've got a more permanent structure in place. But what that does is obviously that protects the groundwater that might be underneath. So totally agree with Brett's point. Sandy soil's not a very good place to be doing the feedlotting. Your clay soils are much better, and generally you can get a fairly good compaction, a good surface compacted underneath that. Sometimes you might need to bring gravel in to compact in there as well. But you do need to be thinking about protecting the groundwater. The community, so another issue. And to be honest, in Queensland, I haven't really encountered this one with sheep feedlots, partly because we don't have a lot of them. But I think the sheep manure just behaves a bit differently in a feedlot situation generally. But if you do have neighbours close by, or like Brett said, you know, your glampers or even just traffic, if you do get rain, they will generate some odour, and so that's something to be aware of. And then also the dust element as well. So Brett covered it pretty well, really, with your best management of most of those things, especially dust, is your carrying capacity or your stocking density inside the pens. But there may even be a need, and from our perspective, another management practice is to be thinking about getting into those pens, depending on the density. If you're getting a build-up of that manure, getting in and cleaning that manure out on a semi-regular basis, and that can be used for spreading out over grass paddocks as a fertilizer, or it could be used for composting carcasses. As most of you would know, if you've got livestock, you've got dead stock. So there is going to be those times where you will have sheep dying. Composting within the manure may well be an option there. Obviously, the ecology thing element is more around the water impacts, but also, you know, if you're pushing trees over to build an area for your feedlot, well, then that's something that you need to be aware of, and be aware of what's mapped on your property and what's not mapped, so that you're not knocking over timber that's protected. And then we always recommend, and it's an industry guideline recommendation, to have a good management system in place. And so what I mean by a management system is a written down site management plan, basically, which covers off on all the different risks and how you're going to operate those, or how you're going to manage those risks in your day-to-day management. So, and the guidelines have some really good practical methodologies around how to do that and how to develop one of these documents. Thanks, Millie. Next slide. So, as I said before, there isn't currently an industry environmental guideline for sheep feedlotting. However, the way we look at this is the national guidelines for beef cattle feedlots in Australia, and the national code of practice that follows with that. We do have a small sheep addendum that goes with that, which just sort of translates standard cattle units into standard sheep units for stocking densities, etc. We've also got a little assessment spreadsheet, which is really useful for helping you decide, well, how big an area do I need to set aside for this? And how big an effluent pond might I need if I'm going to do this as a proper feedlot? It has a nutrient mass balance for utilising the manure and the effluent that comes off the feedlot, etc. So that can be a really good tool for you to use in planning ahead, and understanding sort of what site requirements you're going to need to consider. It also has that separation distance calculator in it, which helps manage the community impact that you may have, just in terms of separation from the feedlot to your neighbour's house. And you might also consider the separation to your own house, potentially. And I know Brett talked about this the other day, just in terms of siting and, you know, being aware of the impacts that that might have on your own lifestyle as well as your neighbour's lifestyle. And look, we're happy to provide a copy of these documents and the assessment spreadsheets to you free of charge, of course, and you can just contact us for those or any other questions that you might have. Thanks. Next slide, Millie. So look, this is just covering some of the same stuff. Really, that section in red is really just talking to the fact that you need to have a think about the way that the bedding that you might need to use, or the pen surface that might need to be used, because the sheep manure really doesn't behave in the same way as feedlot, cattle manure in a cattle feedlot. We talk about a manure pack in a cattle feedlot, and often that's used as a bit of a defence. Cattle feedlots, you often will get, like, you know, up half an inch to an inch of manure build up over the full pen surface over time, and that can actually provide almost a plasticky sort of a layer, which just helps protect the groundwater impacts and seepage into the ground. As far as I understand, sheep manure just doesn't do that. Maybe if you got them in a really high density, that might happen, but generally I don't believe it happens. So it's just thinking about these sorts of nuances that might apply to sheep feedlotting. Yeah, we generally will expect, just so that everybody's aware from the get-go, that we generally do expect that a sheep feedlot will have some sort of an effluent pond on it, which then basically collects all the stormwater runoff from the feed pad, and then you can then capture it. It's not running off into waterways or uncontrollably, and then you can irrigate that out onto grass country or cropping country, depending on the size of the feedlot. Thanks, Millie. Next slide. We must be coming close to the end. There we go. So look, yeah, to some of the listeners, some of this stuff isn't going to be applicable, or you weren't thinking, oh, we're going to build a feedlot, but it really serves to be just a not even a warning, but just so that you are aware of what the regulations are in Queensland. We're more than happy to have a chat with you at any point in time. We try and be as open to questions and phone calls as we can be. So feel free to call us anytime or send us an email on those details in front of you there. We'll even happily have a chat with you if you come in to the office here in Toowoomba, and we can sit down and sort of talk through what you're planning to do. Depending on where you're located and where we're at different times, we are also happy to do on-site pre-lodgement visits as well with you, so where we come out onto your site and actually talk through your plans in the field. So but yeah, I want to stress, yes, we're regulators. Yes, we do compliance of feedlots. However, we really do want to work with our producers. Our role is to help you to understand how to comply with the requirements under the Environmental Protection Act. And even if you aren't a feedlot, we can still help you, or you're not intending to build one. It's temporary sort of a situation. We're happy to sort of talk through what our expectations are as an environmental management point of view for your confinement feeding. We can at least talk you through what we would expect, the minimum that we'd expect from that point of view. Yeah, so look, thanks very much for your time, everyone, and we'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Brett's still on the line there. One has a question that they would like to ask. And yeah, we've got Ben here still as well. So I'm just having a quick look at the chat to see if there's any in there. But go ahead and unmute if you've got a question.
Millie, it's Craig. Thanks, Brett. Nice to see Mr. Littler. Welcome to the good country. And thanks, Ben. I guess my question's more to Ben, and that's to say, I noted the numbers per that constitute a feedlot, except in drought-declared conditions. Now, is that per pick or is that per property? Because, I mean, we've got people that have got multiple properties under one pick, and then we've got entities that have got multiple picks across multiple properties.
Yeah, Craig, that's a good question. And it does come up from time to time. So, yeah, look, what we're talking about there is in any particular feedlot setting. So if you've got a set of yards or a confinement feeding area where you're feeding sheep, then that will apply to that area. So if they've got another property under the same pick somewhere up the road and they've got another one of these set up, well, then it would again apply in that scenario. So if people sort of use this as a way to get around the rules, I suppose. And I guess the only thing I can say there is, yes, if it starts crossing over multiple lots, we would consider that as one activity. But yeah, if you've got it on multiple lots, I guess it's a case-by-case basis. There'll always be somebody that tries to push the boundaries, and we just take it as we see it, I guess, and work with them to explain our expectations. Yeah, does that?
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, the overarching point that you made is it's outside of drought declarations, although we've probably got an issue in Queensland where we're moving, our drought policy is changing. So are we going to actually have drought declarations in the future? So that just means a change to the reg. But I suppose the intent of containment feeding is about, maintaining body condition on breeders, this is in my world, acknowledging all the other things it could be used for, but it's about maintaining your core breeder herd and maintaining ground cover so country responds quickly when it does rain. So it is possible that you would have multiple containment feeding structures on multiple properties. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't disagree, and part of, why it's so relevant. What you're saying is the number of people that are now saying, well, if I've invested this much in building containment feeding, then I'm going to use it for other stuff in peacetime. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We had a question there from Pete and Kylie. Using self-feeders in confinement, how many head per feeder? And Brett, I see you've popped in some recommendations there, but is there anything else you wanted to touch on that?
That number's for a square feeder, so when they're shoulder on shoulder. So some of the silo feeders, that number's a little bit lower because obviously head to head, they're able to get the head in and eat. So that space. What I would say, just be a bit careful. There's a couple of companies running around and they're moving that number. That number's pretty well supported. I know I went out last year to a place that was having some trouble, and instead of 120 to 140 around a standard 2.4 metre sort of feeder, the recommendation was 240, and there was a heap of competition. We had some issues that came in, and yeah, it's just one of those ones. Just be a bit careful. If it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. What I would also say with self feeders is, I am only aware of one that can limit animals down a fair bit. So once you use these self feeders, you're pretty much in a production feeding type scenario, and particularly with crossies and some of these shedding breeds, trying to get them to eat what they're meant to eat on a given day is a bit hard.
Thanks, Brett. And we had a comment earlier when you were talking, just that deaths from smothering can be a major issue. Do you think that probably comes down to trough space?
Yeah, look, and I also saw the comment before that. It's so invariably you'll get the doom and gloom, Brett. So because I'll go out and I'll go, shit, what's going on here? Someone's had a problem. I get the call out. You go out, you have a look. Invariably, what I would say is the rule about number of head in a given area and the amount of trough space, that competition really does kick in. And you know, it really is that extreme competition for them to try to get that feed, particularly depending on how often you're feeding, etc. That really comes into it. I'm actually a bit of a fan of, while I'm trying to get them up and going, to do trail feeding. So you're on the ground for a little bit, even though I've said don't do it. You can do it to start them, because you're not limited by how long your trough is and everything else. So you can run it out longer and everything else like that. What I would also say is, you know, you can get away with some of these rules for a certain period of time, but the longer the feeding goes on, the more you get near the edge of that mob size rule, trough space rule, all those type of things, the more of a tail of a mob you'll end up with. And you know, I had an example where I had a producer, not something I'd recommend, who was feeding 400 merino ewes in mobs because they were a huge operation. They were using favour beans, they were trail feeding, bugger all waste, and everything else like that. And you know, this bloke, he's going, oh, everything's going well. I said, yep. I said, but at some stage in the next period, you're going to have to go in and pull the tail out. And he ended up having to go in and pull 20 to 30% of that mob out and treat them differently and feed them a bit differently. So yeah, it's always, you get the doom and gloom, Brett, so apologies, but that's my bit of my experience. But what I would say is just be aware of those rules. That manual's got a lot of those rules in there. Yep, you can break them, but be aware that there's some hard lines. The water one's one I don't mess with though.
Are there any other questions before we wrap it up?
I've got it away easy.
Yeah, you have. All right then, we'll wrap it up there. So thanks everyone for attending today, and thank you, Brett and Ben, for your presentations. That's given us a great overview of some of the fundamentals for people considering containment feeding. For anyone else who's interested going forwards, please let us know through the feedback link that I've popped in the chat if you would like to see anything more on containment feeding through the PDS, and we might be able to deliver something on that next year. I would also like to add that there is a 25% co-contribution grant up to $50,000 called the Drought Preparedness Grant, and that's available for new and permanent infrastructure projects that help you prepare for and manage drought. Containment feeding setups have been approved activities for that grant. So that's something to be mindful of if you are considering investing in this infrastructure. And if you'd like any more information on that, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me or any other DPI staff, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction. So thanks again for joining us today. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill out our feedback form as we're going into reporting this week. So that would really help us. But other than that, I hope you enjoy your week and have a very Merry Christmas. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Millie.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
everyone.